Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture series on using accommodations with riders. My name is Beth Liesenfeld. I'm an occupational therapist who helps hearts and horses out at the Temple Grandin Equine Center and soon to come to the main campus of Hearts and Horses. Now, I've got to admit something, that this lecture was actually recorded last night and I messed up. And I didn't hit the recording until the third or fourth slide. So I'm back today to give you the first 3 or 4 slides so we can splice it together for you so it makes more sense, because without the intro, it's really hard to catch up and know what I'm talking about. So we're talking about accommodations, which is things that we do for our riders and even each other to help us learn in the best way possible. And there's this amazing document called the IEP for any school-age children that you might work with. And we're going to talk about how that document has accommodations in it, some examples of accommodations, and what that looks like. You probably already do them all the time, but I'm just giving a name to what you're already doing. So again, I'm Beth Liesenfeld. I'm an occupational therapist. I mainly work in schools right now, and I also do 1 day a week for Hearts and Horses, and that's going to continue into the spring. So if you've helped out with the autism study up in Temple Grandin Equine Center, thank you so much. And hopefully I will see and meet more of you as I come to the main campus in January. I've been here off and on, so I feel like I know some people really well because they've been on those days that I've been working, and then some and most of you I don't know at all. So like I said, I currently work in schools. I've worked in outpatient clinics before. I've also historically worked in home health, inpatient rehab, and of course, equine-based therapy. Thankfully, like pretty much all of my OT career has been in and out of this equine-based therapy as well. I've been a PATH instructor for 11 years, it says on the slide, but I actually just did the math, and it's been 14 years that I've been a PATH International instructor. Actually, they were called NARA back then, so I have the old certificate from a long time ago. So I also just started an online business called ParentFriendlyOT, and I'm teaching parents how to better understand the IEP process, because as I throw out all these acronyms at you, I'm sure you can imagine that the IEP process is really hard to understand because it's a legal document, it's a legal process. So I'm breaking that down for parents. So if you have a parent in your life trying to advocate for their child within the school system, please spread the word about my business. I have an online course that helps parents develop their parent input plan for their next IEP. And I also do workshops and have a podcast as well. So definitely follow me on ParentFriendlyOT on Instagram and Facebook and share it to your network. I would greatly appreciate it. And then at this point last night, we went through and just had everybody who attended kind of roll through their role at Hearts and Horses. We had a really nice mix of volunteers and instructors. So it was about a half and half mix, and you'll hear some of their input as well as we go on. So the purpose for the session is I want you to be able to identify what an accommodation is. I was talking to a volunteer that was there last night, today when we had our last sessions at the Temple Grandin Equine Center, and she was like, oh, I never thought of it as an accommodation. And then when we talk about how we accommodate other people in our lives, she was very surprised by that. So it was really nice to hear that feedback this morning. I want you to be able to understand some common examples of how we accommodate others and even how other people accommodate us. Realize when working with a child who is school aged and they go to public school that they might have a really nice start in accommodations through their IEP. And if you're working with somebody who's an adult that might have had an IEP when they were school aged, that still might be pretty relevant. There still might be things in there that have not changed as they've gotten older in how they prefer to learn and what's the easiest way for them to learn. And finally, I really want you to understand what the instructor role and what the volunteer role is in helping implement those accommodations. And we go into this a little bit further. It's really amazing, this partnership that we have with each other, because especially in group classes, you as the volunteer have so much power and so much insight because you are with that one person the whole entire class. So you might be able to problem solve a lot of these accommodations because you're trialing different things and trying to figure out what's the best way to help and to teach, right? And then the instructor, of course, has a really good line on the history of that child, of the relationship with the parents, of, that macro view of stepping back and seeing what's working in their instructor, instructions as well, for lack of a better word, instructor instructions. You get my drift. So at this point, I'm going to let Emmy splice in the rest of the lecture from last night as I started the recording on this slide from last night. Thank you so much for coming and showing up. And please let me know if you have any questions at all. My email address is hello@ParentFriendlyOT.com. Thanks for coming. Okay, so we're going to jump into terminology and definitions. So first is the accommodation, which I've mentioned several times already. So this is the providing of what is needed or desired for convenience. So that's something like in this definition, the example would be, oh, we accommodated your schedule to schedule the meeting, right? And then an adaptation or an adjustment, which in my brain fits more to what we do for our riders, is we adapt what we're doing or we adjust what we're doing. And just because I'm both a therapist and a PATH instructor, the differences between those two is that when you're instructing, the goal is always to teach them how to ride, right? My goals always look like, the skills we're talking about is steering or 2-point or, I don't know, I blanked, you know what I mean, like horse skills. And then in therapy, they could have absolutely nothing to do with the horse at all. So when we're talking about a skill, let's take steering for an example. The accommodations could be ladder reins, which if you don't know what ladder reins are, they have like the reins that go to the horse's head, but then they also have a connection piece. So it looks like a ladder so that person, maybe they only have one use of one hand, so they can hold in the middle and they can make it shorter by moving up to the next rung, or they can make it longer by moving back on the rung. So that's an easy adaptation to steering, right? You could teach them how to neck reining, which is also another skill, tennis ball on the reins. Like there's all of these different things that you can do to adapt those reins to still have them steer. You're still doing the same skill, but you're making it a little bit different, right? So the second huge terminology is the IEP, and that's an individualized education plan. And this is for a school-aged person going through school, somebody who has qualified as a disability through one of the qualification categories of the state. So it's different state to state. But this IEP is a legal document. Usually it's like 10 pages long. It's a little bit ridiculous. It has a lot of stuff in it. But in it, you can find out just a ton of information about this student. It has like their strengths and the things that they're working on, the things that they struggle with. It has the impact of their disability. So if that's fine motor skills or social skills or a learning disability that impacts academics, that's all going to be in there. And then identified goals and services. So that would be like special education services, like teacher services, or therapy services in there as well. And it also has accommodations and modifications in it. So we're going to go through some actual case examples of accommodations that I kind of selected and pulled out of actual IEPs, and I modified just a little bit so you can't tell who it is. But we're going to go through that towards the end, and you will see how amazing it is to have like somebody already figure out what works for this kid. And I've often wondered, like, what would my accommodations be? It would be doing all work first thing in the morning and nothing in the afternoon because I'm like worthless in the afternoon, right? So those kind of things where we work best in this situation, that's what they are. And you can imagine, you guys can always figure out these accommodations as you go. We've been doing it for a long time, but just imagine if we started asking for that IEP or those accommodations, if the parents wanted to share them in that evaluation, and then we could bring that to the volunteers and say, hey, we're going to do this, this, and this for this kid. It'd be so helpful. And they would learn how to ride so much quicker probably and be, most of the time, riders aren't frustrated when they're there because, like everybody said in the introduction, Hearts and Horses is our happy place for sure. But they would learn a lot more and learn better, in my opinion.
If I can jump in there, Beth, really quick, and just having worked with IEPs for 30 years, the material or the information that is derived all comes from very objective testing done by a counselor and the psychologist at the school. So that if you can get your hands on that information, I will tell you it is gold. It's pure, and it helps you with not only where are they, but where are they going to go. It's gold if somebody's willing to give that to you. And I know a lot of those parents probably would be.
Yeah, or at least that section. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but maybe just that section. And that's, in my opinion, probably the most useful section of that IEP when we're talking about teaching them how to ride, for sure. And then 3, like I mentioned in the intro, a modification is changing what somebody is learning. So, we're going to throw out steering and we're going to replace that with a different skill. So like we're changing those expectations, right? So we might, and I want to say accommodate, but that's not the right word. We might modify the activity for them and just always know that we need a leader for them. Like that's not a goal, is to have them steer without a leader independently, right? So we're going to say, it's all good. You're going to learn other skills related to horseback riding, but it might not be steering on your own, and that's okay, right? So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and let me know as we go. So fun little quote, accommodations don't lower the expectations for what kids learn. So to give you an example, the probably most confused accommodation / modification in an IEP in the school setting is kind of shortening assignments. So if somebody has a worksheet, like a math worksheet, let's say, that has like 20 problems on it, and people write in the accommodations like shorten assignments, but really that's a modification because they're not expected to do the exact same thing. Now, an accommodation for that would be to fold the paper in half so they only see half at once, so they don't get overwhelmed, or they get multiple breaks between that math assignment. Maybe they do it for a while, they get a break, they come back and do it again. So that's kind of an alteration of how they're doing it, but they're still doing the same thing as everybody else. Hopefully that makes sense. You guys get a throwback picture. This is me when I was like 8, maybe. And we found this horse down the road, and he was just a pasture pet. We got to show him in 4-H for free if we like watched this gal's barn and fed for her. And he ended up knowing like flying lead changes. So it was crazy. We're like, he's literally just sitting in the pasture and he has like all of these crazy skills. It was awesome. So let's talk about some examples. We already threw out some examples of accommodations, but let's kind of dive into it a little bit more. So we talked about changes in equipment, right? Ladder reins, which I explained, a Western versus an English saddle. So sometimes people, and Western saddle is flatter and it gives more support. And so some people need that Western saddle, so they sit in something and kind of like keeps them in place a little bit more. So that's just kind of an easy accommodation. They're still riding, they're still doing all the skills, they're just in a different saddle, right? And then a bareback might be one as well. We actually just did this in my session 2 weeks ago. So an autistic child was complaining because every time he went to trot, the stirrups would bang against his ankles and would hurt, right? So it's a kind of a sensory sensitivity thing. So I'm like, no worries, we can do a bareback pad next time, no stirrups. And guess what? He like stayed regulated and participated the whole entire time instead of like shutting down a little bit because he was really comfortable. So easy peasy, right? Changes to cueing. This is a big one for volunteers. So we can give verbal cues, we can give visual cues, we can give gestural cues, and there's a lot more than this too. Tactile being one of them. If you're going to steer and you kind of tap somebody's hand, hey, your right hand goes to your right hip, that's a tactile cue, right? For autistic kids, sometimes too much verbal is too much. You kind of have to cut that out a little bit if they get overwhelmed. So you might cut out some verbal cueing and instead do gestural or visual. And for me, it's kind of fun, to be honest, because I don't talk a lot by nature. Obviously I talk a lot, but I love having that like silent lap to warm up. It kind of like brings me down stress-wise too. So there's a really, really easy ways and different ways to accommodate somebody. If they're a visual learner, guess what? We're going to like have somebody demonstrate what you're doing. Like the 2-point is a really hard thing to explain, right? But if you show somebody, they're like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. And then changes in how skills are presented. So small chunks. So instead of giving them the whole obstacle course at once and explaining all the skills in big detail in the beginning, maybe you teach one skill at a time, you learn that skill, then you move on to the next thing in the obstacle course instead of doing everything all at once. That's pretty overwhelming, right? Sometimes volunteers need that because they need to know where they're going and what the plan is. So realize that sometimes when that big plan is given, the expectation isn't necessarily that the volunteers tell the writer everything and reinforce everything in that really big cue. But sometimes we're doing things for you guys as volunteers, and sometimes we're doing things for the writers themselves. How much repetition? One of my favorite lessons is like a jump course, which is just poles in a pattern. But you literally have to stand up and sit down in a 2-point, I think 5 or 6 different times, but it's really interesting because you go into this like crazy little figure 8. So that's a really great way to keep engagement, but also a lot of repetition on one skill so that you can get it down, right? So massed practice is an amazing way to teach. And if you know that somebody learns best in mass practice, then that's a great lesson plan for them, right? And then the same routine or a different routine every time. Most of the time, our writers benefit from the same routine, and most of us do too. Going to be honest. So if we know what's coming and we know the general structure of things, we feel much more comfortable. And then at the beginning, as instructors, if we give a heads up on what is changing for that day, hey, we're going to go outside after we do our lesson inside, we usually have a much easier time, right? That goes with like kind of visual schedules too, or prepping somebody with, like for our autism study that we're doing at CSU, Katie Peters, the principal investigator, made a social story video of what the arena looks like, what you're going to look like when you get on, what the mounting ramp looks like, you know, that you're going to put a helmet on and this is where you're going to do it. So that anticipation and kind of like setup expectations is really good too. So I do want to list at the bottom, there's just a couple of these skills that we might be compensating or accommodating for, right? So cognitive skills. I remember, I think the first accommodation that I learned when I was a sidewalker, or I was actually like a horse manager first, but it was that wait time, right? So if somebody is slower processing, that you give the instruction and then you wait like at least 10 seconds, which feels like forever, but it actually works. And you're like, oh, okay, they just needed time to process and then we're good to go. And I remember doing that with the first kid that I worked with. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that's such a simple thing to do, but I would have repeated that instruction 50 billion times and then been like, why aren't you doing it? I don't understand. Executive functioning, which is, I mean, the easiest example is just to talk about ADHD. So that frontal lobe, like inner traffic cop person. So that's that, you know, cueing back to for attention and for sequencing skills, like all of those kind of more complex cognitive functioning is our executive functioning skills. Physical skills, I think we can see, I think those are the easiest ones to figure out that we need to accommodate, right? Sensory skills, which I just gave that example about the bareback pad, and then learning and reading and math skills. And you would think that this wouldn't come up when you're teaching horseback riding, but we do activities all the time where you have to read. And so I'm always careful about who can read and who can't read and how to like tactfully feel that out. So again, if you have these accommodations from this IEP that we're going to talk about next, then you already kind of know if they need like a screen reader, which is the computer reading to them, then they probably don't have really strong reading skills. So you might have to read for them, and that's okay. Do we have any questions so far? Good to go. So as I'm going through some of these examples, do you guys have any examples that you can think of things that you do for the writers that you're working with? And some of you are new, so you're not going to have any quite yet. But do you guys have anything that comes top of mind that you do all the time?
I'll jump in. I'll just say that for the kids in the autism research program, they're just in the classroom and they're not actually writing. But I try to think of all 5 senses when I go to develop the lesson. So everything. Are we up? Are we moving? Are we looking? Are we reading? Are there pictures that go with the words?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff. So
yeah, every style of learning, right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I can talk about one of my kiddos that I lead that's autistic. He gets frustrated if he feels like he's being reminded when he already knows a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've done is I would say, so this is what I do in my lesson. What do you think about that? Or, I have to just, it's how I say it.
Uh-huh.
It's very important and key with him because, he's been writing for a while and he just will squinch up his whole face and say, you don't have to tell me, you don't have to remind me. I know. So I've just come up with the
Mm-hmm.
approach to,
Mm-hmm.
your
Yeah.
weight, your hands, your heels, the whatever.
Yeah, and that's great. I don't know what I would call that accommodation, but I really like it. Giving examples from your own experience instead of directly reminding him. I love that. That's great. That's a great example. Anybody else?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Did I disappear from the video? Or can you still see me?
I can't see you, but I can
Oh.
hear you.
It's okay. I can't for some reason make it to see everybody, but I was going to mention, I think, especially coming from a skills-based background,
Mhm.
I really have to slow it down in my mind and do much, much smaller pieces and just
Mhm.
little bits, because I have so much spinning around in my mind of information that I want to share and want them to learn. But that was definitely the biggest learning piece, like in all of my hours to get certified, was to just be like, take a breath. And I still have to pay attention to that just because that's just where I came from. So I have to do that a lot.
Yeah. And you grew up in a writing situation, right? You have a ton of
I've
course
been
experience?
showing my whole life.
Yeah. So those lessons with like a trainer are like really intense, like do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And you're like,
it's like
whoa.
a fire hose. And Rachel was so great out there. She's like, you need to stop talking now. So I really had to slow down.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
Stopping talking is like my number one favorite strategy. Yeah.
It's hard.
It's so hard because we're all helping people, right? Everybody who's here is a very helpful person. And so you want to feel like you're doing your job and you're helping, but sometimes you need to shut the mouth a little bit to be able to be helpful.
Yes.
Yeah, those are great examples. Awesome. Here's a picture of my Kit Kat. She was a therapeutic riding horse at CTRC. If you guys are familiar with CTRC, I've worked on and off there for a really long time, longer than Hearts and Horses. And I was her retirement home. So I had her for just over a year. And then she had so many injuries that we had to put her down, but she was awesome. She was so, so cool and so patient. Gosh, so incredibly patient. She was awesome. So like I alluded to before, this IEP document has like everything in it, right? And Marnell's saying like all of the crazy testing that's done and all of the information that's in there. Just imagine if somebody's already figured that out, right? So the IEP is a plan that is updated every single year. So it's a legal document that has to be renewed within a calendar year of when the last one was made. So if somebody, now we're coming into like COVID interruption, which is not a lot of fun because a lot of kids, especially with disabilities, were pulled out and homeschooled for a year, or if they had like higher risk of infection, sometimes parents pulled them out. And so if they weren't enrolled in school then their IEP wasn't updated. So if you have a kid who's like homeschooled, they might not have a current IEP. They might have had one at one point, but it might not be updated. So somebody has to be currently enrolled. And then, of course, when they came back this year, at the beginning of the year, we had to like emergency update all of these kids' IEPs and their evaluations that had been outdated and lapsed in order to be legally like in the good, right? So yeah, so I've already talked about the accommodations as a section specifically for accommodations in there. So there's modifications. It's a little bit rarer to have modifications. That's somebody with kind of an intellectual disability, typically that has that. But the accommodations, I don't know an IEP that doesn't have any accommodations in it. Sometimes a brand new IEP won't have many, but typically there's at least 2, 3, 4 accommodations in there. So a lot of them aren't applicable to the arena. There's some that I took out of the examples because some of them have like 40 accommodations on them, and that's a little bit much. So I took out some of those, but it's something like, a screen reader for reading. There might be, the one that I took out was allow to leave class early, like in a middle school or high school setting, leave 3 minutes early. They're excused if they're 3 minutes late to get to class because sometimes it's so crowded in those hallways that it's hard for them to navigate for different reasons. So that really wouldn't apply to the arena, I guess, but a lot of them are, and a lot of them are really helpful. So we're going to dive into some examples. We're going to look at roles first, apparently. So when we're talking about instructors, so if you have, and I don't know a single place that has this as a policy, but as part of the intake process, people can, or facilities can ask if an IEP is in place. And if parents want to share that, they can. So for an example, if you are going to an outpatient clinic, like outpatient OT, PT, a lot of times we'll ask for the IEP, but of course we can't require it. But it's really helpful for us to see what goals have already been met by a school OT so that we can see it in outpatient as well. So if Hearts and Horses decides to put this into their policy, they might be able to ask, hey, does your child have an IEP? Would you mind giving us a copy, or at least a copy of the accommodations section? And again, that's updated every year. So a lot of times when you go from like a preschool IEP to those accommodations are going to be very different for a preschooler than a middle school or high school student. So a lot of them change year to year. So it's really helpful to have the most recent version of that. So instructors also can ask parents, if you have a new rider or a new rider to you, and you're like, man, we're kind of struggling to figure out some of the things that might be helpful for them. Instructors can always ask parents, of course, away from everybody else, be really cognizant of privacy here, but you might ask, hey, what are some things that could help that would be an accommodation? Or a lot of parents forget that there's this awesome document about their kid. So even just saying, hey, I heard in the IEP, we might be able to use some of those accommodations. Do you mind sharing that with us? And most of the time, our parents are more than happy to, if they can remember to. They've got a lot on their plate, but some of them are like, oh yeah, totally. I have it in my email. Let me forward it to you. So you'll have those parents too. And again, they don't have to share this. This is a legal confidential document, but it is really helpful. And if you explain, hey, we just learned that accommodations could really be helpful. And if there's something that we're missing that we can incorporate into the session to help them learn or reinforce goals that they have at school, then most parents are going to be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. But again, it's up to them. It really should be the instructor. So we'll talk about volunteer role in a second, because you guys actually implement a ton of accommodations, and sometimes even more so than the instructor. But it really should be in the instructor or staff member who asks the parents, and not the volunteer for any paperwork kind of things. I know you guys know that. I'm just saying that to cover my own butt, right? And if volunteers have questions about strategies, ask the instructor, because the instructor might have some strategies that they just didn't realize you were struggling with this, or how to present information. Or if you just come up after class and you're helping cleaning up or whatever, you can say, hey, are there things that you've noticed that help them, you know, in cueing wise or in learning skills, that kind of thing? Usually, from my experience as an instructor, when you have like 4 or 5 different things going on at once, you are kind of playing traffic cop a lot of the times. And then you're paying attention to skills and you're taking what I call like kind of a snapshot in your brain so that you can document it later on what skills and how much cueing they needed for each skill and blah, blah, blah. So a lot of times we forget that we should really relay that information to you guys as volunteers. So don't be afraid to ask. It's usually up there. It's just flooded by a lot of other things going on, just like everybody, right? So volunteers, you guys have a ton of insight. And I see this happening in schools as well, where the paraprofessionals who are educators' aides spend a ton of time with those kids. And it's the same thing with volunteers, right? Ellen was talking about how she's changed the way that she approaches them because she's making him kind of frustrated. And so likely you might know the accommodations better than even the instructor, especially in like a big group class, right? That instructor isn't going to know every little thing of what's helping. So sometimes you know a lot better than even the instructor does. So communicate these strategies to your instructor. If you are noticing that, oh, what's a good example? Oh, I've had this happen before. So we used to be really strategic about, especially like in group classes, who gets on first. And we used to have a bigger group class when I was working in Indiana. And there was one particular student that just needed some silent time. He needed to get on and walk around the arena for a little bit, and then he could get into the lesson. So it was random order that they got on most of the time. It was just like the row in the middle of who would get on. But after we figured this out, and I believe it was a volunteer that brought this up, I was like, oh, we'll just get him on first. So we got him on first, and then the 3 other kids got on second, third, and fourth. Well, while we were getting the other kids on, that kid had time to decompress and just get into it and get ready. And then he was on point once we started. So again, that comes from a volunteer. An instructor isn't necessarily going to realize that, especially when we're trying to get 4 kids on as quickly as we can to get started. We're not going to notice that somebody is needing more time to warm up than that. So you guys are so important to knowing all of these little details. And it's really cool because there's a lot of people who volunteer with the same people and the same writers for a really long time. And even the instructor could change and it doesn't really matter much because the volunteer is the same, right? It's pretty awesome, actually. And this, especially for sensory sensitivities too, you guys might notice that something happens and they have a reaction. And that's really important for us to know too. Even the example that I just gave with a bareback pad, that totally came from the volunteer on the offside. She was like, I think what happened, because the kid stopped talking. He got like overwhelmed with the stirrup hitting his leg. And so I didn't really know what happened. And it was a volunteer on the offside that said, I think the stirrup is hitting his leg and that's what's bugging him. And then she asked him and he confirmed. And then I was able to make the change. So that's with me sidewalking on the other side. The volunteer noticed and I didn't. So you guys are super important for that. So if you have a relationship with a family, and like I just mentioned, some volunteers have volunteered with the same people for a really, really long time. So you can relay strategies and say, hey, I've noticed this works. Do you have any more strategies for me? But again, try to go through your instructor before you go directly to the family and involve the instructor in that conversation as well, so that they know what's going on. So here's a couple examples of like how you would word that. I've noticed when I give some wait time before repeating a question, they can answer me better. And so just confirmation from the parent. Sometimes the parent won't think to tell you those things, but if you bring it up, then they're like, oh yeah, totally. Because guess what? They've been accommodating for that kid. And I keep saying kid, it could be for an adult too, for a really, really long time. So they don't even notice it, right? It's like me accommodating to my husband accommodating to me. He doesn't even realize he's accommodating to me anymore because we're just used to it. That's just life. So sometimes parents don't even think to tell us some things, and that's okay too. And then they might kind of respond with, oh yeah, and then at school they do this, this, and this, right? They might just not know to tell you that. Okay, so let's get into examples. Any questions? Or are we okay? Okay, all right, cool.
Looks good.
Good.
Yep.
Awesome. So we're going to go through a couple examples, and I've kind of pulled out the main players, I guess. I don't know. So we have a couple autistic students, one from elementary and one from middle school, and then a couple with Down syndrome, elementary and middle school, and then kind of a developmental delay, which means that we don't really have like a medical diagnosis for that kid yet, but we just know what's working for him so far. And a speech and language impairment, which just means they qualify for speech. All right, and at the end, I know that it's 6:46, but at the end, if you have anybody that comes to mind that you want to problem solve or like kind of talk through what you do for them, that would be awesome too. I'm game for that. So these are really long lists. So I'm not necessarily going to address every single one. So I'm going to kind of give you some time to process through and read. I know some of you guys are on your phone, so that's going to be tiny. So you probably can't see that. So let's talk about this autistic person who's in elementary school. So adult facilitation for inclusive rather than solitary play, right? So they're needing some social skills coaching. Cool. That totally applies to the arena, right? Adult facilitation for topic maintenance. So this might mean that they kind of drift in their attention, right? Encourage a glance at a person with answering and asking questions. This brings up a point that a lot of stuff is changing, especially with the autistic population. We are not requiring eye contact at all. The glance at a person might be because they're so distracted that people don't realize that they're talking to them. So they need some sort of body language to indicate that they're being talked to or they're talking to somebody else, right? They might be working on that as a social skill. Preferential seating for attention, which just means that they might need to be closer to the teacher so that they can not be distracted by others. So this is kind of important when you think about, kind of coming into the center for instruction. Is that going to be distracting to be facing everybody else? I don't know. You'll have to see. Structured learning opportunities. So that's that kind of same routine. You incorporate a lot of structure. Maybe you have 3 things that you give as cues for a 2-point every single time. So that's really consistent and structured. Maybe that's going to be really helpful. Predictable routine and expectations we've talked to. Check for understanding of group directions, which I feel like every volunteer pretty much does. Break assignments into manageable portions and reduce visual distractions. So you can see how this might be helpful. Some of it's like, yeah, we can figure that out pretty quickly. And then sometimes it's like, oh, that's really nice to know. So this next one is a autistic person in the middle school environment. So obviously it's a little bit different. They're switching classes, bigger classes in most times. So this transactional support comes from a model that's called the CERTS model. And so it's kind of a hierarchy of skills for autistic people. And you might see some like really wonky terminology in the IEP because it's so jargony and so hard to understand. But if you Google things, of course, you will figure it out. So this transactional support is just accommodation. So that comes from that CERTS program. That's what are we doing for them to change their environment to make it easier for them to learn. So this is kind of clumped together. So visual schedule to help with transitions, trained and constant adult support for transition, self-care needs, learning, and safety. Really nice if they need to get off the horse and need to use the bathroom, that they probably need support for that, and you can grab the parent real quick and let them know that they need support. Highly structured activities, pretty common knowledge for autistic individuals, right? Clearly defined seating to assist with attention and learning. Activities should involve manipulatives and visual stimuli as much as possible. So again, going back to that 2-point position, you might want to have a visual, right? Because auditorily explaining it might not be your best option. Change location to increase access or use equipment. So that might mean they get overwhelmed by a certain environment. They might need a change of place. Divide assignments into steps. Preferential seating, again, that's one that you'll see on a lot of IEPs. It's really, really common. Reduced distractions, that's another really common one. Visual cues, including adult or peer modeling of expected task when needed. This is really cool if you kind of have a group lesson and somebody already knows what the 2-point is and can demonstrate that. It's my favorite example, right? The 2-point is pretty hard to explain. So, or you can video somebody of doing the 2-point and you can show that right before you do that skill, right? Much easier to explain than, because also you don't want to touch them. So you don't want to be like, you need to stand up here, but then sit back and like put things on your hands. It's complicated, right? Access to digital books or other learning materials as appropriate for classroom participation and independent work. Visual supports for behavioral reinforcement, such as 10 to 15 pane start chart. So they must be doing some sort of reinforcement. Most of the time we don't need them on the horses because the horses are reinforcement enough, because if it's not fun, then they're probably not going to come back, to be honest, because it's optional. Note about behavioral interventions. So this is another thing that's changing in the autism community, is that these kind of rewards are not preferred. So we're trying to do away with these, like, do an unwanted task and then you'll get something that you want, right? So I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on that, but just know that some of this terminology might be kind of old terminology. Okay, those are our autism examples. Does anybody have any to add that you've seen or done with autistic individuals? This is a lot of information, isn't it? Processing. Okay, so here's an individual with Down syndrome in middle school. This particular person, I think I took out 2/3 of what they had in there, so you really have to sift through them. Allow extra time to get to class, right? So this is one that might not be helpful, but if I think about this individual and how she would look in the arena environment, she would need extra time to come up to the mounting area and just like make that transition, because they're not the quickest one to transition from one area to the other. So you could see how that would make sense and be helpful. Directions given orally and in writing, and clarify those directions. So have that person repeat them back sometimes is helpful. That's one that's very common on here too. Allow utilization of word processor. Probably not applicable unless they're doing some assignment. Divide assignments into steps. Extended time, 50% and above on kind of assessments. So that might be like a processing time thing too. Minimize memory demands. So if you have this really complicated obstacle course, let's say, you might want to have like a written map for that somewhere. Or if it's visual, it's probably a little bit easier to remember. But that might be something that you work on within a session as well with them. Preferential seating, again, it's in everyone, almost everyone. Organization tools, reduce distractions to the student, video supports when available, structured environment, and notes, outlines, and instructions provided, which of course is going to happen, right? And then here's our last example, and this one is for a label of developmental delay and speech language impairment. So again, no like official diagnosis, because the schools don't officially diagnose anything, but there are these 13 different categories. So a person can be on developmental delay on an IEP until they turn 9. So you might see this in some of your younger kids, but when they get older, it should be a different category that more clearly defines their needs. So this one is provide cues or anticipate needs for movement. So this is a kid who needs to move. And you would think that in the arena environment that you're going to move a lot, right? But I have known instructors, like, we're different, right? So there's a lot of instructors that kind of pull everybody into the middle for the instruction piece. And then there's instructors who leave them on the outside of the arena and walking while they give that instruction piece. And this might be a good feedback from a volunteer to say, they can't sit that long. And you can definitely tell with the horse when the horse starts like moving around and getting antsy too, that might be an accommodation for your horse, and it might be an accommodation for your kid, and it might be for both, right? I typically love to move and I don't like to stand for very long. So I probably would have them move. Repeat directions back to the teacher. Again, kind of an attention concern there. Sound blockers is needed. That's really nice to know. Maybe the waiting area is really noisy. Maybe you need to pull them out and ask that they get on the horse first because it's noisy. You might notice that. Meeting with teacher before the next school year. So this might be also anticipation, hey, the instructor is going to be gone. There's going to be a sub next week. Those kinds of reminders might be helpful for this person. Movement breaks before focused work, introduction and use of calming strategies, such as, but not limited to, belly breathing or gum. One of my favorite things to teach on the horse because they directly pick up on your emotions. So when you teach the kids or those adults those calming strategies, and it's for the horse instead of them, it's like amazing. It's awesome. And it really works too. Pair information with visuals. So again, it's nice to have that 2-point visual right there in the arena. On task peer model, really nice, like that demonstration person. Preferential seating, there it is again. Proximity to adult as needed. Check in after directions, single step directions in large group settings. Extra work time. Prepare for changes in schedule. High expectations to encourage best work. And chunking work. That high expectations to encourage best work is kind of like, they're kind of lazy, right? Without saying it that way. Or they need that peer model to model what it is to do things the right way, right? Generally don't call people lazy, but sometimes it's a really formal way of saying something else too. So here's a problem solving section, and we do have, I don't know, like 15 minutes left or so. Can you think of any riders that you would like to problem solve or that you would like to talk about? And again, just a reminder, no identifiable information. So no names, no like specific information, but more about the problems that you think might be able to be accommodated. So does anybody have like even a story to share about somebody who comes to mind when we're talking about these actual examples of accommodations?
Hi, Beth. Can I chat?
Hey, yeah, of course.
Hey. Hi, everybody. So I am on this monthly case conference with one of our students, and it's not with the school, but it's with, kind of the rest of the people on this student's team. And what I'm learning is that the school is not really like on board with any of the accommodations that this student needs. And I guess my question for you, Beth, is like, who manages the IEP? Like, is there a point person where it's like, okay, this is the person we need to go talk to, or we need to get this person into our case conference every month so that the school can start, bringing some of these accommodations in? I mean, is there somebody that kind of is the point person? Is it?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they are the case manager. So if it's somebody who, and it kind of depends on the category, and maybe we can chat off the recording about that if you need to, but if it's somebody who receives special education, so those teacher services, so they qualified in math or reading, it's probably going to be the special education teacher. And if you happen to have a copy of the IEP, it's going to be on the signature page that's that person. And usually they sign in a different spot because they're the case manager. So you might be able to tell that way. If it's somebody who just receives speech and language services, that case manager is going to be the speech therapist. Anybody else like an occupational therapist, physical therapist, psychologist, we're all related services. So we're never a case manager. So it's most often a special education teacher. And then sometimes it's the speech language pathologist. It sounds like if it's a whole big case conference that it's probably a special education teacher, I would think. Do you guys have a copy of the IEP?
Yes.
Okay, you might be able to look at the signature page on that and figure it out.
Okay.
Yeah, it should have their
Great.
contact information on there too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
Yeah, they're legally bound to have those accommodations in place, but the problem is a lot of general education teachers are the ones that actually implement the accommodations, and they have no special education instruction. So, so we're expecting these teachers to be able to implement all these strategies that they have no idea of how to even go about doing that. So
Yeah,
it's
I
interesting.
think that could be the case here for sure.
Yeah. Yep. Have you guys come up with accommodations through working with that person?
Yes.
Like new ones? That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. It just seems like this student would be able to move so much farther along if everyone was on the same page, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's
Imagine
why,
that.
yeah, I know, right? That's why it's so helpful. Like, I don't know if assuming that Hearts and Horses doesn't do this, but if we started asking for the accommodations on the IEP from parents at that intake portion,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
might be really fun to see what they already
Totally.
have.
I made a note, Beth, when you were mentioning that, because that's not something that we have in our enrollment, but I think we can easily put that on. And if the
Mhm.
parents are willing to share, that's just going to give us this treasure trove of information.
Yeah, especially if that person is nonverbal, if the rider coming in is nonverbal. So helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Is there anybody else with any other riders you want to talk about or problem solve?
I have a question
Mhm.
about a rider has autism and the behaviors are aggressive, which is so unusual. I've not experienced that. You know, usually the kids are a little bit more shy, a little bit more gentle. It's a large animal. This particular student is aggressive behaviors. How would you accommodate or adjust for that? Because it could become potentially dangerous for the rider if the horse is not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, the first thing that I would ask is, do they have a solid way to communicate?
Yes.
Awesome. And just as a side note, Tamara made this most amazing thing for our nonverbal riders that their talker, she collaborated with a volunteer and they made a holder
Uh-huh.
for the AAC device on the horse. So cool.
I saw it in a video. It's amazing.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
So I would ask if they have a way to communicate.
Mhm.
And then if that's reliable, like, do you know why they're getting aggressive? Like, can you delve into the reason why at all?
That's a good question.
Because then you can anticipate it and you can accommodate it.
Okay. Okay.
And
So for this whole thing, before we even get to that point, it would be a conversation to have with them.
mhm.
The person's very articulate, extremely articulate, but just behaviors and movements are very aggressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of autistic individuals get flipped into that fight or flight. I've had a kid that I had in the clinic. We always co-treated with him, like speech and language and me as well. But there was one incident where he accidentally hit his hand on the table and it was nobody's fault. And the speech therapist was the closest one and he attacked him.
Wow.
So it does happen, but in that case as well, it's a combination of him not having a consistent way to communicate and this like fight or flight. Like their brain is just wired differently, so they flip into that fight or flight sometimes a lot quicker than anybody else would.
That's really helpful. Thank
A
you.
lot of times, if he can problem solve with you, though, a lot of times it's like avoidable. It's like
Mhm.
something in the environment that we can change. Either it's a transition, which is really, really hard for a lot of people to do, is transition from one thing to the next, or it's something unexpected, or something is scaring them. Even as far as like, a door slamming or things like that. I mean, that can set somebody off too.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody else? Okay, we're coming to the end. So again, if you have anything else, feel free to hang on the call. For more IEP information, if that's something that intrigues you, if you have somebody that you know that is a parent and needs some help with this IEP process, because as you can imagine, it's really, really complicated. So I've started a business, ParentFriendlyOT. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and my main bent is to teach parents more about the IEP process so they can advocate better. So go ahead and share that to whoever you think it might be helpful for. That would be awesome. And I am going to stop the recording.